Good afternoon, dear international guests, and I have to say in particular from Tunisia, but also from many other countries. Dear colleagues and fellows from the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg Center for Global Cooperation Research, but also beyond. And in particular, I would also like to welcome the students who have actually arrived here. They partly come from our university, but also partly from other universities, and that shows there is a strong interest not only in Tunisia, but also in the post-revolutionary processes of the Arab world. Today we're going to have the second Käthe Hamburger dialogue, as we call it. As you know, it's on religion and politics in post-revolutionary Tunisia. And actually, it's still quite topical. You might remember that the whole process started in 2010. And in 2011, most of the revolutions took place. I was just reminded, when we prepared this event, that one of the publications that the German Peace Institutes are issuing, the Peace Review 2011, somehow celebrated the Arab Spring. I think that 3 years later, we have become much more sober.
Dear friends and colleagues, I'm delighted to stand here in front of you. Welcome all of you very, very warmly, in particular our Tunisian colleagues who flew over to attend the event and present their work tomorrow. My aim here is to introduce to you in 1, maximum 2 minutes, the movie, meaning I'm here to explain to you why you should absolutely stay after the lunch break. There are 2 reasons for this. The first one is the topic of the movie itself. The movie deals with the growing lack of distance between the society and religion in Tunisia already before the event known as the Arab Spring or the Jasmine Revolution started. So in the framework of our general discussion on secularity and modernization, the movie is basically a discussion of the growing religiosity in Tunisian society, and also, perhaps it's also a movie on the social hypocrisies that you can find within the society when the Ramadan period takes place. The second reason why you should also absolutely stay after the lunch break is that the movie director, Nadia Alfani, is going to be there with us. So we'll watch the movie together, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and perhaps also to learn more from a very direct experience, because this is a movie that came with a number of personal costs for Nadia. So more on this in, 2 hours' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I also would like to welcome you. And yes, I'm not the Tunisian ambassador, if you still look at the old program and are disappointed now. The upheavals in the Arab world came to a surprise to the scholars as well as to the outside world. Even scholars dedicating their entire life did not expect the kind of dynamic that took place in the region. There were indicators for change, like the high unemployment rate, but it was not clear when and how these indicators would affect the development in the respective countries. The people in the streets proved everybody wrong in 2011 and already in 2010 that they would not put up with injustice, corruption, and miserable living conditions any longer. This is not an easy situation, but still, Tunisia is different. If it manages a peaceful and successful transformation, it sticks out and it has the chance to serve as a role model in the region. Because the Arab world is looking very, very closely of what's happening in this country. Tunisia could be very well the blueprint for success with positive effects all over the Arab world. Here, the setting up of the constitution was a key, not only as a legal document, but as a sign that religious and secular forces can be joined in the effort to pave a way for Tunisia's future. And it could serve as an example for cooperation and compromise that this works. The implementation is another thing. And also here, the question how to balance religious aspirations and religious issues and secular ideas is also still something the country has to cope with. Tunisia stands out. Today, we want to explore its recipe for success and focus on the foundations for a viable democratic transformation. We have here now Mrs. Asma Nouria in the first line, who's a professor in political science at the University of Tunisia Al-Mana and also Secretary General of the Tunisian Observatory of the Democratic Transition. We also have Dr. Radwan Mahmoudi, and President of the Study of Islam and Democracy in Washington, D.C., and we have Dr. Markus Böckenförde, who's an Executive Director at the Käthe Hamburger Kolleg and a scholar of international law by training. With that, I want to thank you and open the discussion and ask you to join me here at the table.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you for inviting us to this event and for hosting this event and this debate about the political situation and the role of religion and politics in Tunisia. Very quickly, I just have some few introductory remarks that I hope will be helpful in the discussion. So the first question, the question of the relationship between religion and politics has always been a difficult one, even in established democracies such as Germany or Europe or the United States. So it is normal and to be expected that this issue will also be one of the difficult and most difficult and divisive issues in facing post-revolutionary Tunisia or any country that is trying to build a new democratic order, such as Egypt, of course, and Syria, and Libya, and Yemen. This issue is probably the most difficult and the most divisive issue facing all these countries. I believe in Tunisia, we are lucky to have a strong middle in the Tunisian society that believes in finding the need and the necessity of finding a historic compromise between religion and politics. And it is this historic compromise that allowed, in fact, Europe to emerge from dictatorship and tyranny 100 or 200 years ago. And it is the same historic compromise that we need in the Arab world between religion and politics. First, let me talk briefly about the two extreme fringes in Tunisian society, which also exist in most Arab societies. On one hand, you have the religious extremism, which in Tunisia is quite significant and has grown recently, especially after the revolution, and represents, in my estimation, these are not exact or very scientific numbers, but in my estimation represents about 15% of the Tunisian society. These, of course, include the Salafis, the Wahhabis, the Hizb ut-Tahrir, all the radical Islamic parties. And these groups and individuals believe in a rigid interpretation of Islam and of Islamic law, and do not believe in general in democracy or in human rights, and believe that an Islamic state must uphold and implement Islamic laws, as understood and practiced for the past 14 centuries, and that anyone who disagrees with them or with their interpretation is not a good Muslim. So it is fair to say that they don't believe in democracy and that they believe in an Islamic theocratic state where freedom of religion and freedom of thought are basically non-existent. So on one hand, you have this fringe, religious extremist fringe, which wants to impose religion on society. On the other hand, you have secular extremism, which includes the hardcore secular left, the atheists, and hardcore secularists who believe that religion, at best, should be a private matter and should play no role in public life whatsoever. They are influenced both by communism, which believes that religion is a problem or the opium, and is a problem to be fought and marginalized. And also, they are influenced by hardcore French laïcité, the rigid interpretation of secularism in France, which believes that religion and religious values have no place in the public sphere. These individuals and these groups call themselves secularists. But in reality, I believe they misunderstand and misinterpret what secularism really is. Because as it is practiced in every other secular country, with the exception of France. In these countries, secularity simply means separation of church and state, which means separations of the institutions of church and state, and do not mean separation of religion or of religious values from politics or from public sphere in general. In the US, for example, both Democrats and Republicans often and regularly make appeals to religious values. And they make these strong and repeated appeals to religious values in the American culture and society to justify certain policies and to appeal to the public for public support. So now we come to what I call the middle in Tunisia. So again, you have the French, the secular extremists on one hand, and religious extremists on the other hand, but the majority of Tunisians are in the middle. And I think roughly 70% of Tunisians are in this middle. What do they believe in? This overwhelming majority of Tunisians believes that religious or Islamic values are a fundamental component of Tunisian identity, culture, and political thought. Islam is not new in Tunisia. Islam has been the main and dominant religion in Tunisia for the last 14 centuries. And Tunisia has always been a center of learning and a center of Islamic thought and Islamic culture throughout its history, for the entire region. Therefore, they want a state or a political system that respects this identity and respects religious values and symbols. They do not, however, want a theocratic state or a state that imposes religion on people, because most Tunisians are very tolerant and understand Islam to also be a tolerant religion that rejects any kind of imposition of religion on people. And there is, of course, the famous verse in the Quran that says there is no compulsion in religion. So the majority of Tunisians, and I believe the majority of political parties in Tunisia, want a civil state that respects religious values and principles without imposing them on individuals or on the society at large. This majority was silent, or to be more precise, was silenced under the dictatorship of Ben Ali, but now is gaining back its voice and its role in Tunisian society and in Tunisian politics. Writing the constitution was the best opportunity to rebuild this center and to find the necessary compromises between all political parties and between Islamists and secularists, or what I prefer to call moderate Islamists and moderate secularists. The debate heated up in 2013, mainly for political reasons, but civil society organizations worked very hard to bring the two sides together and to find and to provide venues for dialogue, for discussions, and for compromises. Finally, arriving at a consensual constitution, which was adopted on January 26 of 2014, by the overwhelming majority of elected members of the National Constituent Assembly, 200 members out of 216 members, representing more than 20 political parties, voted to accept and ratify the new constitution. The dialogue was not easy and at times was extremely difficult, but I believe it was essential for building a modern democracy in the Arab world. A constitution, by definition, has to be for all citizens, and not only for the majority of citizens. And this is the main success of the Tunisian democratic transition so far, certainly in comparison with Egypt, where we had two separate constitutions, but both of them were only representative of the half of the society that wrote the constitution and excluded the other half. And therefore, these constitutions in Egypt basically only served to divide the Egyptian society rather than to unite the Egyptian society, which is the main purpose of the constitution. The dialogue in Tunisia about the new constitution centered and focused mainly about the question of the role of religion in politics. All of the difficult questions that were hard to deal with had to do with the role of religion and politics, or the relationship between religion and politics, and the balance between individual freedoms and human rights, which of course must be respected, and around Islamic norms, religious and cultural values, which also had to be respected. I believe one of the main reasons for the success of the Tunisian experiment so far is in fact that Tunisia has one of the more moderate or most moderate, pragmatic and modernist Islamic parties in the Arab world, if not in the Islamic world, known as An-Nahda Party, and also one of the most progressive and pragmatic Islamic thinkers in the world, in the person of Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi. Since the beginning of the process of writing the new constitution in March of 2012, as soon as the assembly started to write or to begin the work even of the dialogue of writing the constitution, Nahda decided almost unilaterally, because at that time there was no real pressure from anybody, not to include Sharia laws in the constitution. This was in March 2012, exactly 2 months after the assembly started its work. I believe that this was a key step in the right direction, without which Tunisia would probably have failed in reaching a consensus, not because people in Tunisia are against Sharia, but because there is no consensus on what Sharia means. There are different and differing interpretations of Sharia, from the hardcore Islamists who believe that Sharia includes all the laws and the punishments and hudud laws and everything that has been written in the past 14 centuries, while modern and modernist Islamists believe in the concept of goals of Sharia, or in Arabic, maqasid al-Sharia, which basically states that Sharia is whatever serves the people. Whatever is in the interest of the people is what Sharia is, or is what Sharia wants. And therefore, you have different interpretations of Sharia, and this is why it would have been impossible to reach a consensus on Sharia or on including Sharia in the Constitution, because it depends what you mean by Sharia. Finally, and in conclusion, I want to emphasize the really important and critical role that civil society organizations played, hundreds and thousands of them, played in bridging the gap between these political parties. It is normal that political parties fight. That's what political parties do. They are machines that fight because they want to win elections. And basically you win elections by beating your opponent. That's what political parties do all over the world. But it is civil society that brings political parties together. I think civil society is the glue that binds the society together. And this is really what made the difference in Tunisia, is that civil society played a key and vital role in bridging the gap and in bringing the different political parties together and facilitating the discussions and the debates necessary for finding the compromises. So I'll stop there. I know I don't have a lot of time, but hopefully we can continue in the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think civil society, to be labeled as glue, is very smart, but I also would say civil society can put a finger into the wound and turn the attention to things that are not so easy to manage. We will hear second voice now. We will hear Asma Nuria, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this debate, to this important event. But sorry, I will speak in French because it's more comfortable for me. Donc j'étais appelée à parler de la religion et la constitution en Tunisie. Et parce que je n'ai pas beaucoup de temps, je vais présenter rapidement quelques idées qui me paraissent principales et importantes. Je vais commencer par 4 remarques préliminaires. D'abord, quand on parle de religion en Tunisie, on parle de l'islam, uniquement de l'islam parce qu'il s'agit de la religion de la majorité des Tunisiens, donc à peu près 98% de la population tunisienne. Aussi parce que l'islam constitue l'élément essentiel dans l'identité tunisienne. Deuxième remarque, la question de la religion en rapport avec la Constitution ou en rapport avec l'État n'est pas nouvelle en Tunisie, puisque la question a été débattue aussi dans le processus ou lors de l'élaboration de la Constitution de 1959. Donc, elle a apparu dans les débats, mais aussi dans le texte constitutionnel de 1959. Mais le débat était posé en d'autres termes. Peut-être cela est dû à un contexte différent. C'était le contexte de la décolonisation et la construction de l'État national. Mais aussi, et je pense à mon avis, c'était aussi dû à des acteurs différents qui étaient en confrontation à l'époque. Donc à l'époque, pour la Constitution de 1959, il y avait les acteurs religieux ou ceux qui représentaient la religion ou défendaient la religion, le porte-parole de la religion, c'était l'institution religieuse traditionnelle dans le sens religious establishment. Donc il y avait les ulamas de l'islam constitués en une institution et représentaient donc la partie religion. Par contre, aujourd'hui, ceux qui parlent au nom de la religion sont des partis politiques ou des mouvances politiques à une idéologie religieuse ou qui trouvent sa source dans la religion. Donc c'est l'islamisme. Mais dans les deux cas, en 1959 et aujourd'hui, cette élite religieuse ou cette partie religieuse se trouve face à une élite séculariste en 1959 ou aujourd'hui. Il est à noter que cette élite séculariste n'est pas forcément en confrontation avec la religion ni contre la religion. Donc elle n'est pas forcément pour la séparation entre État et religion ou politique et religion. On va voir ça, donc je vais revenir sur cette question en parlant de l'article 1er de la Constitution. C'est un exemple type pour montrer que cette élite séculariste n'est pas forcément une élite anti-religieuse ou anticléricale. Troisième remarque, si on compare les 4 drafts de la Constitution de 2014, on va remarquer que la question n'est pas constante, c'est-à-dire elle a évolué, elle a changé d'un draft à l'autre. Cela dû aux plusieurs dynamiques internes au sein de la Constituante, mais aussi et surtout aux dynamiques externes et à la pression notamment de la société, et la pression et le lobbying de la société civile de deux bords, c'est-à-dire islamiste et aussi séculariste. Quatrième remarque qui sera mon entrée en matière, c'est les questions portant sur la religion en rapport avec la Constitution peuvent être classées en 2 grandes catégories. D'abord, les questions qui sont en lien ou qui relèvent directement du champ religieux ou de la sphère religieuse. Et là, je cite la question de religion de l'État, la religion et droit et les libertés religieuses. Deuxième catégorie, c'est en principe des questions profanes qui relèvent du profane, mais qui ont été débattues en termes de religion. Et là, c'est principalement la question des droits de l'homme et des libertés. Il y a d'abord la question de la liberté et le sacré, donc comment protéger le sacré, la dialectique entre les libertés, la protection des libertés et la protection du sacré et vice-versa. Il y a la question des droits des femmes et enfin la question de la peine de mort. Donc faute de temps, parce que je ne pourrais pas présenter toutes ces questions, je vais me concentrer sur la première catégorie et deux questions principales. D'abord, la question de la religion de l'État, particulièrement l'article 1er de la Constitution, qui est une reprise de l'article 1er de la Constitution de 1959. Cet article stipule que la Tunisie est un État libre, souverain, indépendant. Sa religion est l'islam. Cet article est ambigu et il a fait beaucoup d'encre. Il était l'objet du débat doctrinal et politique tout au long des dernières 50 années. C'est un article ambigu parce qu'il prête à interprétation. On peut l'interpréter dans les deux sens, soit dans le sens d'une séparation de la religion et de l'État, soit dans le sens d'une confusion. Mais si on voit les implications de cet article durant les dernières 50 années, on va remarquer que cet article a été le fondement constitutionnel et légal de la mainmise de l'État sur la religion. C'est-à-dire la religion a géré les affaires religieuses depuis 1959 en se fondant sur cet article. Il est à mentionner que cet article a été introduit ou était une proposition du président Al-Habib Bourguiba, donc qui représentait l'élite séculariste par définition. Donc on voit comment cette élite séculariste a introduit un article qui fait aujourd'hui l'unanimité. Il fait l'unanimité parce qu'il s'agit d'un article ambigu et son interprétation dépend largement de ceux qui détiennent le pouvoir. Donc si ceux qui sont au gouvernement, au pouvoir, sont des islamistes, donc on va l'interpréter dans le sens de l'islamisation de l'État. Si le gouvernement ou ceux qui sont au pouvoir sont laïcs ou sécularistes, ils vont l'interpréter dans le sens de l'étatisation de la religion. Donc dans les deux cas, il n'y a pas une séparation entre religion et État en Tunisie depuis 1959 et ça continue puisqu'on a repris cet article et on a ajouté un paragraphe pour interdire l'amendement de cet article. Donc ça devient définitif. Dans le même sens, cet article-là, pourtant, on l'a interprété dans un sens séculariste, c'est-à-dire dans le sens de la non-application de la charia ou le droit musulman en Tunisie. Pourtant, le gouvernement en 1980 s'est basé sur cet article pour s'opposer ou pour émettre des réserves sur les conventions de CEDAW, c'est-à-dire la convention sur l'élimination de toutes les formes de discrimination à l'égard des femmes. Les islamistes aussi, dans leur littérature depuis les années 90, on voit très bien qu'ils interprètent cet article dans le sens de l'application de la charia. Ils ont toujours appelé à l'application, ou depuis, avant qu'ils deviennent un parti politique qui participe au pouvoir, ils ont appelé à l'application de la charia en vertu de cet article premier. Donc justement, cette ambiguïté qui est en cause, ou c'est grâce à cette ambiguïté que les membres, les antagonistes politiques, avant même les élections, sont tous d'accord pour garder cet article. Mais les sécularistes, conscients des risques de l'interprétation de cet article pour instaurer un État religieux, et c'était le débat autour de cet article, ils ont introduit un autre article comme garde-fou. Il s'agit de l'article 2 de la Constitution qui stipule que la Tunisie est un État à caractère civil, basé sur la citoyenneté, la volonté du peuple et la primauté du droit. À mon avis, cela n'a pas de sens, car généralement, dans la littérature, on oppose l'État à caractère civil à l'État militaire, pas à l'État religieux ni à la théocratie. Aussi, l'histoire musulmane n'a pas connu de théocratie et le califat tel qu'il est défini par la pensée politique classique et vécu historiquement n'est pas une théocratie, dans la mesure où le pouvoir a été détenu par des profanes et des profanes qui ont la légitimité traditionnelle, donc au sens weberien. En d'autres termes, le gouvernement est légitime, c'est-à-dire islamique, du moment où il applique la charia ou le droit musulman. Et cela nous mène à la deuxième question devant laquelle je veux m'arrêter, la question de la religion ou l'islam et le droit. Donc, bien que le droit tunisien, en grande partie, trouve ses sources dans le droit musulman, les sources matérielles bien sûr, il est un droit sécularisé puisque le pouvoir législatif appartient depuis l'indépendance à un pouvoir profane. La question ou le débat autour de l'application Sharia a ressurgi après, aussitôt donc en 2011, et avec l'apparition des nouveaux acteurs, des anciens nouveaux acteurs religieux qui appellent à l'application de la Sharia et l'instauration d'un État islamique. Quand on parle d'un État islamique, c'est généralement l'application de la Sharia. Bien sûr, ils ont demandé à insérer ou à introduire un article qui porte sur la reconnaissance de la Sharia comme source formelle du droit tunisien. Cela n'a pas abouti. Certains pensent que cela est dû à la pression exercée par la société civile. Oui, en quelques mesures, c'est vrai, mais à mon avis, cela est une explication d'ordre secondaire, car je pense que la proposition faite par le parti Ennahda à la constituante d'introduire la Sharia comme source principale du droit n'était pas sérieuse dès le départ. Parce que je pense, à mon avis, cela fait partie des mécanismes de négociation politique de ce parti, avec ses alliés d'une part, et avec ses adversaires d'autre part. Donc avec ses alliés pour avoir leur soutien, avec ses adversaires c'est un moyen de négociation, pression pour avoir d'autres acquis politiques. Et je pense au niveau donc, de l'expérience, le processus constitutionnel, la Sharia n'était pas une priorité, mais la priorité était plutôt d'instaurer un régime politique parlementaire. Donc la négociation se jouait en fait à ce niveau-là, mais à chaque fois on mettait la pression sur des questions qui paraissent secondaires par rapport aux questions principales pour pouvoir négocier les autres acquis politiques. Mais de toute façon, si on a abandonné cette proposition, ou l'abandon de cette proposition ne résout en rien la question de l'application de la Sharia en Tunisie, donc la question n'est pas terminée, puisqu'on peut interpréter l'article 1er dans le sens de l'application de la Sharia, mais aussi rien n'empêche que la majorité, si elle est une majorité islamiste au sein du Parlement, de faire passer des lois à caractère, des lois islamiques ou qui trouvent leur source dans le droit musulman. Voilà, donc je vais terminer rapidement en passant par les autres questions et principalement la question de la religion et les droits de l'homme dans la Constitution. En ce qui concerne les libertés religieuses, la Constitution de 2014, comme celle de 1959, protège les libertés religieuses, certes pour les non-musulmans, mais le problème se pose pour les musulmans. L'article 6 protège donc la liberté de croyance, de pratique religieuse, mais il y a eu un débat virulent autour de la question de liberté de croyance et de conscience pour les musulmans. Il y a les associations religieuses islamiques ont essayé de faire pression sur la Constitution justement pour retirer cet article qui porte sur la liberté de conscience, parce que pour eux, cet article-là est une incitation aux Tunisiens d'abandonner leur religion. En ce qui concerne, juste 30 secondes, non, même pas, 10 secondes. C'est 3 phrases. Donc, il y a ici aussi le problème de la protection du sacré qui peut servir comme limitation aux libertés artistiques. Finalement, la question des droits des femmes qui se recoupe avec le problème de l'application de la Sharia. Le débat était surtout autour de la question de l'égalité des sexes, car cela peut mener à une discussion de répercussions sur le droit de l'héritage. Je vous remercie.
So there are more issues on the table that we can discuss, and because we now need some clarity with respect to religion.
I thought actually that the inputs you are providing are a little bit more divisive but they had been quite modest in my view. So therefore, if you look at the gray box, my question to you is just, could you just name a couple of countries that comes to your mind that have this provision, this Article 2 on religion in its constitution? Saudi Arabia was one. Other one? Israel with regard to Islam? No, but okay. No. It's just this text is okay. But that's very interesting. It's an article from a constitution, and it's Article 2, addressing religion. And Para 1 tells you the religion of that state is Islam. Then paragraph 2 reads out, the authorities of the religion of Islam have the duty and the right to teach which principles are right and which are wrong. And the third paragraph, religious teaching of the Islamic faith shall be provided in all state schools as part of compulsory education. So again, my question, what kind of country you think might have taken that provision? Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan. Well, but it's one provision that includes all the 3 paragraphs. So now let me tell you that, and then I already end. This is a fake, although it's only a partly fake, because I only exchanged one term. And the term was the Roman Catholic Apostolic religion with Islam. So the true provision here reads, whenever you have the term Islam inserted, reads the Roman Catholic Apostolic religion. And it's not Vatican State that has this constitution. It's one of our 28 EU member states. So they must have passed the Copenhagen criteria to qualify for EU membership. And apparently, it wasn't a big problem.
So thank you very much to the 3 of you. I always thought drafting a constitution is something really dry and boring. But I was taught a different lesson, and I think it moves very much the hearts and minds in the countries we are talking about, especially in Tunisia.
I think you're right that Tunisian society is divided almost half and half between Islamists and secularists. But there are different kinds of Islamists and different kinds of secularists. And this is what I'm trying to explain or to make the point. There are hardcore Islamists and moderate Islamists. And there are hardcore secularists and moderate secularists. And I think what we are seeing emerging now in Tunisia, especially after the debates about the constitution, is this center which includes moderate Islamists and moderate secularists. And so all these debates have been very difficult. And I have here a report, and I brought with me a few copies that I can give you of the work that CSID did in Tunisia on the constitution. We organized over 80 or 90 conferences and workshops on the constitution, but including 20 or 22 which were closed workshops, 2.5 days each of these workshops. Each workshop was 2.5 days each for 30 politicians, 10 from the assembly, 10 from political parties, 10 from civil society. And in each workshop, they only worked on one particular issue in the constitution where they had differences of opinions. And the goal was that they have to talk to each other for 2.5 days. Sometimes it's just one word, but usually it's just like one sentence. But they have to talk to each other and find a way at the end of the workshop to reword the text in a way that they all agree on. And almost always it worked. And I think that's, the Constitution is not going to end the debate about religion and politics. This debate is going to continue. I predict even 200 years from now, we will still be talking about the role of religion and politics. The Constitution has to be vague by definition, because it has to be flexible. And things could change, and the opinions of the majority of the people could change 50 years from now or 100 years from now. So all constitutions are vague. Of course, after the constitutions, you have to write the laws, and the laws have to be more specific and more precise. But the laws also can change later on. So again, it's always, the difficult issue is always about where you draw the limit. There are freedoms that have to be protected, but freedoms are not unlimited. There are always limits on freedoms in every society. And so the question is, where do you put those limits without infringing too much on individual freedoms or on the interest of the peace and harmony in the society?
Thank you. Asma.
This elite called herself in 1915 the modernists. The modernists, they are people who are educated in French schools, but also in religious schools as Zitouna University and religious scholars. Now they are secularists because they're not Islamists. To make the distinction between people who are not Islamists, they have another way of thinking the relationship between Islam and politics, Islam and state. Also, they are defining the model of the Tunisian society now. They are fighting against imported Islamic model from the other Arab countries. So they are not against religion. Even Bourguiba were not against religion. Just his another view. So he wants to modernize religion. Even I don't think that they are secularist extremists. I don't think so. Which ones? The secular extremists. I don't know who are in Tunisia.
Well, I can make it very brief. I meant the first approach. I mean, yeah, I can give additional explanations, but because in my view, again, there is no neutral approach to, but this is a general observation, individual observation, whether you are looking in your own courtyard or whether you are looking to others. And so if we would start, and I mean, this is actually one of the messages of our center, if we would start in the attempt to enter into global cooperation and dialogue, to start to be clear what is in our own courtyard first, then we might get a better perspective to discuss issues elsewhere.
Je voudrais commencer d'abord par rebondir sur la remarque de Mathieu faite à M. Masmoudi. En fait, moi, je vais remettre en question et Mathieu et M. Masmoudi. Parce qu'à l'heure actuelle, on ne peut pas parler de bipolarisation en Tunisie entre laïcs et modernistes. Et par ailleurs, on ne peut pas également prouver ou bien parler de manière affirmative d'un milieu. Moi, je vais juste faire une petite remarque par rapport justement à cette bipolarisation. Pourquoi on dit en Tunisie? Quelle Tunisie? Est-ce qu'on parle du Grand Tunis? Est-ce que le Grand Tunis est représentatif de la Tunisie? À ma connaissance, il n'y a pas eu dans le sud, dans le nord-ouest ou au centre de la Tunisie des manifestations de la société civile qui appelaient soit à l'application de la charia ou non, ou à l'égalité entre hommes et femmes. Il n'y en a pas eu. Il y a eu ces manifestations-là, cette société civile-là est active sur le Grand Tunis. Mais le Grand Tunis est loin d'être représentatif de la Tunisie profonde. Donc on ne peut pas dire, on ne peut pas parler de bipolarisation à moins qu'on ne réduise la Tunisie au Grand Tunis, à 2 ou 3 millions de personnes maximum. Donc réellement, moi ce que je propose, c'est qu'il y ait des études sérieuses sur cela pour identifier réellement réellement qui a la majorité. Les conservateurs, les extrémistes, les modernistes, les laïcs extrémistes. Et je vous le dis un peu comme ça, de manière de moi à vous, voilà. Moi, je tends beaucoup plus à croire en l'explication de M. Masmoudi qu'à la bipolarisation dont tu parles, Mathieu. En tant que Tunisienne, avec mes notions pas très grandes, mais quand même assez développées de la Tunisie, je pencherai beaucoup plus pour dire qu'il n'y a pas de bipolarisation. Ce terme a été créé par les journaux de gauche français, qui ont été repris par les communistes tunisiens en Tunisie, qui sont très proches de cette mouvance, et de ce qu'on appelle les laïcs, les laïcs extrémistes, ou qui justement veulent complètement faire disparaître la religion d'une société qui est obligatoirement religieuse. Donc c'est artificiel. Et c'est quelques personnes. Par rapport à la Tunisie, à 10 millions de personnes ou 11 millions de personnes, c'est artificiel. C'était ça ma première remarque. Le deuxième volet, c'est par rapport à Madame Nuira qui parlait des oulémas en tant que seul représentatif des protecteurs justement de la religion dans les années 50. Moi, je crois savoir que M. Salah Ben Youssef, l'opposant par excellence à M. Habib Bourguiba, c'était un protecteur de la religion, dans le sens où il protégeait le nationalisme arabe, il était proche justement des nationalistes arabes, il représentait en quelque sorte justement ces Tunisiens-là, cette mouvance politique tunisienne d'après la décolonisation qui voulait justement restituer à la Tunisie son arabité et son héritage islamique. Voilà.
Salah Ben Youssef ne représentait pas la religion. Le conflit entre Bourguiba et Ben Youssef était un conflit au sein du parti de Stour. Donc ça n'a aucune portée sur le problème de la religion, rapport politique et religion. C'est a posteriori qu'on a développé cette image de Salah Ben Youssef comme défenseur de la religion, surtout qu'il a fait quelques discours de la Zitouna. Il avait le soutien du Bey et des Zaytounia. Mais Ben Youssef n'incarnait pas déjà le modèle islamique et donc... Non, même au niveau de la pensée. Il ne s'opposait pas à Bourguiba à ce niveau-là. C'était un problème de leadership au sein du parti.
You ban fasting in Ramadan, which Bourguiba did in the 60s, and he forced people to not fast in Ramadan. That is secular extremists. And when you ban the hijab, which Ben Ali did for 20 years, in fact, even Bourguiba did for 10 years before that, you ban the hijab, the headscarf, in public schools, in universities, in public buildings, and under Ben Ali, even in the streets. People were arrested even in the streets. This has not happened in anywhere else in the world. There is not a single country in the world that has banned the headscarf in the streets, except Tunisia. So we do have a problem of secular extremism. Now, I think it's normal that after dictatorship, after 23 years of dictatorship, maybe more, but at least 23 years of dictatorship, that you have a polarized society. Why? Because that's how dictatorship rules. Dictatorship stays in power by dividing the society. So of course you're gonna come out polarized. Everybody is afraid of the other. Everybody is scared. We haven't had any dialogue about these issues under Ben Ali for 23 years. So of course, in the beginning, there is polarization. And the purpose of democracy and the purpose of writing a constitution and what we have now, elections and so on, is that this polarization slowly will diminish, and then you will have the consensus and the bridge building and the general agreements between all Tunisians, which I agree with you, that on most issues, Tunisians really do not differ on these issues. On most issues, they want a freedom, but they also want to maintain their Arab and Islamic identity and heritage, and they don't really see a contradiction between the two.
Je voudrais dire que ce n'est pas vrai qu'il n'y a pas de bipolarisation en Tunisie que si on appelle de tous ses voeux la démocratie, on ne peut pas imposer à un peuple, quel qu'il soit, et qui que ce soit reconnaisse que la majorité des Tunisiens sont musulmans, que la majorité des Tunisiens sont croyants et même pratiquants. Moi qui suis athée, qui ai eu le malheur de le dire en Tunisie et d'avoir reçu les foudres des islamistes, d'Ennahda, et aussi d'avoir 6 plaintes contre moi en Tunisie, et je ne peux pas retourner en Tunisie depuis 3 ans à cause de ça, vous pourrez m'en dire 2 mots, monsieur. Je tiens à vous dire que si on veut tellement croire à la démocratie, on ne peut pas imposer à un peuple de vivre d'une façon ou d'une autre. C'est ça la démocratie. Or la religion, elle est, à mon sens, et je pense qu'en cela, beaucoup de croyants peuvent me suivre, elle est pour ceux qui désirent suivre la religion. En ce sens, les lois de la religion s'appliquent à ceux qui décident de suivre ces lois. Les lois de la démocratie, ce sont des lois civiles, votées par un parlement élu, c'est ce qu'on a trouvé de mieux comme démocratie jusqu'à présent, et qui s'appliquent à tous, sans distinction. Alors, comment peut-on dire que la démocratie s'installe en Tunisie quand, avant l'article 1, monsieur le juriste, je tiens à vous signaler que dans la constitution tunisienne, il est fait mention de la religion musulmane avant l'article 1, puisque déjà nous commençons la constitution avec au nom de Dieu, le clément, le miséricordieux. Ensuite, il y a tout un préambule avant l'article 1 qui fait référence aux valeurs de l'islam et aux nobles valeurs des droits de l'homme, comme s'il y avait des valeurs des droits de l'homme qui sont nobles et d'autres non, ce qui pose quand même aussi un problème d'interprétation. Et qu'on termine ce préambule en disant « Nous, peuple tunisien, par la grâce de Dieu, nous édictons cette constitution », on se demande comment les députés qui ont travaillé pendant 2 ans et demi peuvent prendre cette histoire-là, n'est-ce pas? Et ensuite, nous arrivons à l'article 1, qui n'est pas l'article 2, et qui dit que l'islam est la religion de la Tunisie. Et en ce sens, on oublie totalement que même s'ils sont ultra-minoritaires, il y a des juifs en Tunisie, il y a des chrétiens en Tunisie, il y a des agnostiques, il y a des déistes, il y a des bouddhistes et il y a des athées. Alors pourquoi ne pas les mentionner aussi dans l'article 1, et à ce moment-là, je voudrais bien croire qu'on est en train de construire une démocratie. J'irai pas plus loin dans tous les articles dont on a parlé, où il s'agit de protéger le sacré, puisque moi-même, n'est-ce pas, je suis poursuivi au pénal en Tunisie pour atteinte au sacré, pour avoir juste fait un film. Alors quand on parle de démocratie, j'estime que les Tunisiens, s'ils sont 11 millions, ils ont droit à des opinions contradictoires. Et ces opinions contradictoires, elles doivent pouvoir s'exprimer au cinéma, à la télévision, dans les livres, dans la presse, dans la rue, dans les arts, partout. C'est ça la démocratie. Et après, on pourra dire qu'effectivement, chacun peut aller voter en son âme et conscience.
I have a question, not an opinion. As you mentioned at the beginning about the 6th article of the Constitution, as we all know, the Constitution was written by a voted parliament that comes from different background in the society. And my question is, would it have been better if it was only written with specialized people from a legal background? Would it protect the minorities? Would it have been more open? Or do you think it was a good idea to put these people in these places to write a constitution without a legal background? Or it should have been prevented from the first place?
The only issue that is important to me, and not only with regard to Tunisia, but also to Libya, where I'm a little bit involved now, is that you still see after that long period of dictatorship that people are speaking from here are we and there is a government. And we need to have a fair deal between the government and us. So actually, this was in the 19th century. But here now, you are the government. I mean, maybe not you individually, but one amongst you. And so you just need to find your way how you want to govern yourself and how you want to be governed, which is then called ownership. And so I don't see a real alternative in creating an ownership, in having, in giving the people a say, who then are part of the society. And of course, as in Tunisia, you had enough experts around that created you a lot of headaches. And then in the phase of implementation, and this is also what I wanted to mention during my inputs, I mean, this is the real, at least similarly important step. The one thing is to write the document. The other thing is to make it work. And if you are not involved in writing it, how can you expect that you are involved or want to be involved or are interested in being involved in implementing it, in making it work? So I don't think that there had been too few legal experts.
Mr. Masmoudi?
I think the first question is, what is the purpose of a constitution? It is to unite the people. It is the foundation on which we want to build a new society and a new government and a new state. And the main function of the constitution is that it unites people, that it lays the parameter on which they all agree, or at least 90% or more of them agree on that foundation. If you have experts who write the constitution, then first of all, who are those experts? And secondly, how are they going to unite the people? In Egypt, you had two constitutions that were written by experts. The first one by Muslim Brotherhood appointed experts. They chose 50 or 60, I don't remember the numbers, but they were experts who had a certain leaning. And of course, that did not work because it did not unite the Egyptian people. And so that constitution was, overthrown or scratched or whatever. And the new constitution was written by experts who represented the other side. And again, it didn't work because it's not uniting the Egyptian people. I really do think that the process that we went through in the last 2 years in Tunisia is the best way to write a constitution. It's not ideal. And I like the new constitution, but it's not ideal either. There are problems in the new constitution. There are certain elements in the new constitution that I personally don't like. And I would have preferred that they would be, changed or written differently. But we were under pressure of time. A lot of Tunisians were very impatient and wanted to finish in 1 year, while on average it takes 3, 4, 5 years to write a constitution. If you look at all the other countries that wrote a constitution, especially a consensual constitution, it is the process of writing the constitution that is more important than the constitution itself. Because if you write, yes, you can bring 10 or 20 experts and they can write the best constitution in the world, but if the people don't really believe in it or don't really subscribe to it, I think it's meaningless. So again, in the new constitution, it's not perfect. I think there are certain sides that Islamists are not happy with, and there are certain sides or clauses that secularists are not happy with. That's normal. That's how you build a constitution. There is give and take in politics. There is compromise. You compromise on this side, I compromise on this, and we stay united. Or you want to impose your opinion on this side, and the other side wants to impose their opinion, and the dialogue breaks, and then we're not united. And I think this is the miracle. And you can see it very clearly between what happened in Tunisia and what happened in Egypt. It's very clear. In Tunisia, we had compromises. People, both sides, compromised. And they're not happy 100% with everything, but they're happy with the constitution. Both sides are happy with the constitution, probably with 80% or 90%, the majority of the constitution, but they can always find certain things that they don't like. And I think that's how constitutions are written, and that's how they work. Now, one of the best things in the new constitution is freedom of expression, which is protected, is freedom of religion, which is protected, is freedom of conscience, which is protected. These are amazing accomplishments in the Arab and Islamic world. And I do agree with Nadia that it is wrong to arrest somebody or to put them on trial for expressing their opinions or for making a movie or anything like that. But again, you cannot build democracy in 1 year or in 2 years. It takes decades to build democracy. And therefore, it is a process, and we have to be patient with that process. Tunisia was one of the worst dictatorships under Ben Ali just 3 years ago. And all of a sudden, you want to hold it to the same standards of France and United States and Germany in just 1 year or 2 years. You want to have the same standards? I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's possible. It is a process. We're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet. I don't think Tunisia is a democracy today. I think it will be a democracy, hopefully 10 years from now, maybe even 20 years from now. It is a process. You cannot build democracy in 1 year.
Then I just have the honor to thank all the three speakers very much for their very thoughtful and thought-provoking interventions, to all you for asking a lot of thought-provoking questions, and also to thank our excellent translators for doing a very good job and tough task.